So the Indian auto industry, India had industrial policy from the 1950s. It made an Indian car, the Ambassador, which was pretty low-tech, low-quality, wasn't globally competitive, right? And the reason for that was that large rents were given to the producers through tariff protection and other kinds of instruments, but there was no compulsion to them to keep on raising their productivity and quality and so on. So the turning point comes in the 1980s when the then Prime Minister's son tries to set up a company to make cars called Maruti, and it totally fails, and the Prime Minister's son dies in an air crash. It becomes a prestige issue for the government to make this work. And so they send their top bureaucrats scouting around the world, find a partner who will make this work. And eventually they find this small motorcycle manufacturer called Suzuki, who has very little knowledge of cars but knows how to make a high quality car. And the Indians do this very interesting deal with them. Suzuki has to come to India, and this is pre-WTO, so this is very important. They have to achieve 65 or 60% roughly domestic content in 5 years. If they do that, they have access to the Indian domestic market, which has at that time around about an 85% tariff. So there's a huge ex-post price, okay? But this price is conditional on meeting domestic content. Now, look at the incentive structure here. Suzuki is a foreign company. It has no political connections. It can't keep on getting the rent or have access to the market if it doesn't fulfill the domestic content requirement, right? So there is no way of capturing this. The Indian agencies have sufficient capability to enforce this part of the deal. So what does Suzuki do? They bring their staff over to upgrade the Indian Tier 1 and Tier 1 producers who can make these parts but have no concept of quality control, of competitiveness, and so on. And they intensively change the organizational structure of the Tier 1 and Tier 2. That's the critical part of making the car. And they do that, and the rest is history, right? Maruti Suzuki is extremely successful. They capture most of the domestic market. Then India repeats this experiment with further foreign investors, each of them with strict domestic content requirements, access to these large rents. This is industrial policy in action. And by the 1990s, Indian branded cars emerged because then Tata and Mahindra use the same Tier 1 and Tier 2 people who by now are globally competitive and are exporting globally to design an Indian car. Because a car, as you know, is not made in the car factory, it's made in the Tier 1 and Tier 2. By the 1990s, India has globally competitive Tier 1 and Tier 2, which is why India is one of the few countries in the world which has an Indian branded, which has a nationally branded car. Thailand makes cars, but Thailand makes Japanese and American cars. India makes those, but also Indian cars. So here is an extremely good example of significant capability transfer driven by financing instruments which are designed, in this case, completely accidentally, again, but which fit the political settlement, which are consistent with the political settlement, which no one has an incentive or capability to distort, and which then results in high effort learning in building up the organizational capability to meet international conditions of quality and price. And that's the secret of development. If you can't crack that, throwing money isn't going to achieve anything. It's going to create a lot of employment opportunities which are temporary, but which will disappear once the subsidy goes, because these are not going to become globally competitive.